Somehow or other, Feely was got onto the branch, and then he did his best to help the Hobbit, although he was feeling very sick and ill from spider poison, and from hanging most of the night and the next day wound round and round with only his nose to breathe through. It took him ages to get the beastly stuff out of his eyes and eyebrows, and as for his beard, he had to cut most of it off. Well, between them, they started to haul up the first one dwarf and then another and slash them free. None of them were better off than Feely, and some of them were worse. Some had hardly been able to breathe at all. Long noses are sometimes useful, you see. And some had been more poisoned. In this way they rescued Keely, Bifer, Bofer, and Dory and Nori. Poor old Bomber was so exhausted, he was the fattest and had been constantly pinched and poked, that he just rolled off the branch and fell plop onto the ground, fortunately onto leaves, and lay there. But there were still 5 dwarves hanging at the end of the branch when the spiders began to come back, more full of rage than ever. Bilbo immediately went to the end of the branch nearest the tree trunk and kept back those that crawled up. He had taken off his ring when he rescued Feely and forgot to put it on again. So now they all began to splutter and hiss.
Now we see you, you nasty little creature. We will eat you and leave your bones and skin hanging on a tree. Ugh! He's got a sting, has he? Well, we'll get him all the same, and then we'll hang him head downward for a day or 2.
While this was going on, the other dwarves were working at the rest of the captives and cutting at the threads with their knives. Soon all would be free, though it was not clear what would happen after that. The spiders had caught them pretty easily the night before, but that had been unawares and in the dark. This time there looked like being a horrible battle. Suddenly Bilbo noticed that some of the spiders had gathered round old Bomber on the floor and had tied him up again and were dragging him away. He gave a shout and slashed at the spiders in front of him. They quickly gave way, and he scrambled down and fell down the tree right into the middle of those on the ground. His little sword was something new in the way of stings for them. How it darted to and fro! It shone with delight as he stabbed at them. 6 were killed before the rest drew off and left Bomber to Bilbo. Come down, he shouted to the dwarves on the branch. Don't stay up there and be netted, for he saw spiders swarming up all the neighboring trees and crawling along the boughs of the heads of the dwarves. Down the dwarves scrambled or jumped or dropped, 11 in all in a heap, most of them very shaky and little use of their legs. There they were at last, 12 of them counting poor old Bomber, who was being propped up on either side by his cousin Bifer and his brother Bofer, and Bilbo was dancing about and waving his sting, and hundreds of angry spiders were goggling at them, all around and about and above. It looked pretty hopeless. Then the battle began. Some of the dwarves had knives, and some had sticks, and all of them could get at stones, and Bilbo had his elvish dagger. Again and again the spiders were beaten off, and many of them were killed, but it could not go on for long. Bilbo was nearly tired out. Only 4 of the dwarves were able to stand firmly, and soon they would all be overpowered like weary flies. Already the spiders were beginning to weave their webs all around them again from tree to tree. In the end, Bilbo could think of no plan except to let the dwarves into the secret of his ring. He was rather sorry about it, but it could not be helped. I am going to disappear, he said. I shall draw the spiders off if I can, and you must keep together and make in the opposite directions. To the left there, that is more or less the way towards the place where we last saw the elf fires. It was difficult to get them to understand, what with their dizzy heads and the shouts, and the whacking of sticks and the throwing of stones, but at last Bilbo felt they could delay no longer. The spiders were drawing their circle ever closer. He suddenly slipped on his ring, and to the great astonishment of the dwarves, he vanished. Soon there came the sound of lazy Lob and Attercop from among the trees away on the right. That upset the spiders greatly. They stopped advancing, and some went off in the direction of the voice. Attercop made them so angry that they lost their wits. Then Balin, who had grasped Bilbo's plan better than the rest, led an attack. The dwarves huddled together in a knot, and sending a shower of stones, they drove at the spiders on the left, and burst through the ring. Away behind them now, the shouting and singing suddenly stopped. Hoping desperately that Bilbo had not been caught, the dwarves went on, not fast enough, though. They were sick and weary, and they could not go much further than a hobble and a wobble, though many of the spiders were close behind. Every now and then they had to turn and fight the creatures that were overtaking them, and already some of the spiders were in the trees above them and throwing down their long clinging threads. Things were looking pretty bad again when suddenly Bilbo appeared and charged into the astonished spiders unexpectedly from the side. "Go on! Go on!" he shouted. "I will do the stinging!" And he did. He darted backwards and forwards, slashing at the spiders' heads, hacking at their legs, and stabbing at their fat bodies if they came too near. The spiders swelled with rage and spluttered and frothed and hissed out horrible curses, but they had become mortally afraid of Sting. They dared not to come very near now that it had come back. So curse as they would, their prey moved slowly but steadily away. It was a most terrible business and seemed to take hours. But at last, just when Bilbo felt that he could not lift his hand for a single stroke more, the spiders suddenly gave up and followed them no more, but went back disappointed to their colony. The dwarves then noticed that they had come to the edge of a ring where the Elfires had been. Whether it was one of those they had seen the night before, they could not tell, but it seemed that some good magic lingered in such spots, which the spiders did not like. At any rate, here the light was greener, and the boughs less thick and threatening, and they had a chance to rest and draw breath. There they lay for some time, puffing and panting. But very soon they began to ask questions. They had to have the whole vanishing business carefully explained, and the finding of the ring interested them so much that for a while they forgot their own troubles. Balin, in particular, insisted on having the Gollum story, riddles and all, told all over again, with the ring in its proper place. But after a time, the light began to fail, and then other questions were asked. Where were they, and where was their path, and where was there any food, and what were they going to do next? These questions they asked over and over again, and it was from little Bilbo that they seemed to expect to get answers, from which you could see that they had changed their opinion of Mr. Baggins very much, and had begun to have a great respect for him, as Gandalf had said they would. Indeed, they really expected him to think of some wonderful plan for helping them, and were not merely grumbling. They knew only too well that they would soon have all been dead if it had not been for the Hobbit, and they thanked him many times. Some of them even got up and bowed right to the ground before him, though they fell over with the effort, and could not get on their legs again for some time. Knowing the truth about the vanishing did not lessen their opinion of Bilbo at all, for they saw that he had some wit, as well as luck and a magic ring, and all these are very useful possessions. In fact, they praised him so much that Bilbo began to feel there was really something of a bold adventurer about himself after all, though he would have felt a lot bolder still if there had been anything to eat. But there was nothing. Nothing at all, and none of them were fit to go and look for anything, or to search for the lost path. The lost path! No other idea would come into Bilbo's tired head. He just sat staring in front of him at the endless trees, and after a while they all fell silent again, all except Balin. Long after the others had stopped talking and shut their eyes, he kept on muttering and chuckling to himself. Gollum! I'm just blessed. So that's how he sneaked past me, is it? Now I know. Just kept quietly along, did you? Mr. Baggins, buttons all over the doorstep. Good old Bilbo. Bilbo, Bilbo, Bo, Bo, Bo. And then he fell asleep, and there was complete silence for a long time. All of a sudden, Dwalin opened an eye and looked round him. Where's Thorin? He asked. It was a terrible shock. Of course, there were only 13 of them, 12 dwarves in the Hobbit. Where indeed was Thorin? They wondered what evil fate had befallen him, magic or dark monsters, and shuddered as they lay lost in the forest. There they dropped off one by one into an uncomfortable sleep full of horrible dreams, and evening worse to black night. And there we must leave them for the present, too sick and weary to set guards or take turns watching. Thorin had been caught much faster than they had. You remember Bilbo falling like a log into sleep as he stepped into the circle, right? The next time it had been Thorin who stepped forward, and as the lights went out he fell like a stone enchanted. All the noise of the dwarves lost in the night, their cries as the spiders caught them and bound them, and all the sounds of the battle the next day had passed over him unheard. Then the wood elves had come to him and bound him, carried him away. The feasting people were wood elves, of course. These are not wicked folk. If they had a fault, it is a distrust of strangers. Though their magic was strong, even in those days they were wary. They differed from the high elves of the west, and were more dangerous and less wise. For most of them, together with their scattered relations in the hills and mountains, were descended from the ancient tribes that never went to ferry in the west. There the light elves and the deep elves and the sea elves went and lived for ages, and grew fairer and wiser and more learned, and invented their magic and their cunning craft in the making of beautiful and marvelous things, before some came back into the wide world. In the wide world the wood elves lingered in the twilight of our sun and moon, but loved best the stars, and they wandered in great forests that grew tall in the lands that are now lost. They dwelt most often by the edges of the woods, from which they could escape at times to hunt, or to ride and run over the open lands by moonlight or starlight, and after the coming of men they took ever more and more to the glooming of the dusk. Still elves were there and remain, and that is good people. In a great cave some miles within the edge of Mirkwood, on its eastern side, there lived at this time their greatest king. Before his huge doors of stone a river ran out of the heights of the forest, and flowed on and into the marshes at the feet of the high wooded lands. This great cave, from which countless smaller ones opened out on every side, wound far underground and had many passages and wide halls, but it was lighter and more wholesome than any goblin dwelling, and neither so deep nor so dangerous. In fact, the subjects of the king mostly lived and hunted in the open woods, and had houses or huts on the ground and in the branches. The beeches were their favorite trees. The king's cave was his palace, and the strong place of his treasure, and the fortress of his people against their enemies. It was also the dungeon of his prisoners. So to the cave they dragged Thorin, not too gently, for they did not love dwarves, and thought he was an enemy. In ancient days they had wars with some of the dwarves, whom they accused of stealing their treasure. It is only fair to say that the dwarves gave a different account, and said that they only took what was their due, for the elf king had bargained with them to shape his raw gold and silver, and had afterwards refused to give them their pay. If the elf king had a weakness, it was for treasure, especially for silver and white gems. And though his hoard was rich, he was ever eager for more, since he had not yet as great a treasure as the other elf lords of old. His people neither mined or worked metals or jewels, nor did they bother much with trade or with tilling the earth. All this was well known to every dwarf, though Thorin's family had nothing to do with the old quarrel I have spoken of. Consequently, Thorin was angry at their treatment of him, when they took their spell off him, and he came to their senses, and also he was determined that no word of gold or jewels should be dragged out of him. The king looked sternly on Thorin when he was brought before him, and asked him many questions, but Thorin would only say that he was starving. "Why did you and your folk 3 times try to attack my people at their merrymaking?" asked the king.
"We did not attack them," answered Thorin. "We came to beg because we were starving."
"Where are your friends now, and what are they doing?"
"I don't know, but I expect starving in the forest."
"What were you doing in the forest?"
"Looking for food and drink, because we were starving."
"But what brought you into the forest at all?" asked the king angrily. At that, Thorin shut his mouth and would not say another word. "Very well," said the king. "Take him away and keep him safe until he feels inclined to tell the truth, even if he waits 100 years. Then the elves put thongs on him, and shut him in one of the inmost caves with strong wooden doors, and left him. They gave him food and drink, plenty of both, if not very fine, for wood elves were not goblins, and were reasonably well behaved even to their worst enemies, when they captured them. The giant spiders were the only living things they had no mercy upon. There in the king's dungeon poor Thorin lay, and after he got over his thankfulness for bread and meat and water, he began to wonder what had become of his unfortunate friends. It was not very long before he discovered, but that belongs to the next chapter, and the beginning of another adventure in which the Hobbit again showed his usefulness. What happened to the Hobbit? What happened to our other dwarves? We know what happened to Thorin Oakenshield. Go ahead into your reading logs, fill in the last, after the chapter's questions. Give me your highs, give me your lows, give me your plots, all that type of stuff. And we will see you for chapter 9, Barrels Out of Bond. Real quick. Bye.